In a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, where modest houses lined streets dotted with maple trees, lived Mr. Chen, a 78-year-old retired high school teacher. His days had become a predictable routine since his wife passed away 5 years ago. Every morning, he would water his small garden, prepare a simple breakfast for one, and spend hours looking through old photo albums, remembering happier times. The approaching February brought with it not just chilly winds, but also Mr. Chen's birthday. It would be his 79th, though he hadn't celebrated properly in years. The thought of another silent birthday made his heart heavy as he watched families in his neighborhood bustling about their daily lives through his living room window. One particularly cold afternoon, while Mr. Chen was arranging his groceries on the porch, he noticed a little girl, about 7 years old, sitting on the sidewalk near his house. She wore a purple jacket that seemed a size too big and clutched a worn-out sketchbook. Her eyes were fixed on the ground as she drew patterns with a stick in the thin layer of frost. Something about her solitary figure reminded him of himself. Instead of going inside as he usually would, Mr. Chen cleared his throat and spoke, "Aren't you cold sitting there, little one?" The girl looked up, revealing bright eyes and a small gap between her front teeth when she smiled. "A little," she admitted, "but I'm waiting for my mom. She works at the grocery store across the street and gets off at 6. Mr. Chen glanced at his watch. It was only 4:30. "That's quite a wait in this weather. Would you like some hot chocolate? I can make it right here on the porch where everyone can see us." He wanted to be careful not to make her uncomfortable. The girl, who introduced herself as Amy, nodded enthusiastically. As Mr. Chen prepared the hot chocolate on his small porch table, Amy showed him her sketchbook filled with colorful drawings of animals and flowers. Her artistic spirit reminded him of his late wife, who used to paint watercolors in their sunroom. "These are wonderful drawings," he said, carefully handing her a mug of hot chocolate. "You know, my birthday is coming up this Saturday. I was planning to make some dinner, but it's no fun celebrating alone. Would you like to come with your parents? I make pretty good spaghetti and meatballs." Amy's eyes lit up. "Really? I love spaghetti. Can I bring my drawings to show you?" "Of course," Mr. Chen smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. "But make sure to ask your parents first. They can come to meet me tomorrow if they'd like." When Amy's mother arrived, Mr. Chen explained the situation. Mrs. Zhang, a hardworking single mother, was touched by the invitation but understandably cautious. She promised to stop by the next day to discuss it further. That evening, Mr. Chen found himself humming as he cleaned his house for the first time in months. He pulled out his wife's old recipe box, searching for her special meatball recipe. The thought of sharing a meal with others made him feel alive again. The next day, Mrs. Zhang visited during her lunch break. She was a kind-faced woman with tired eyes that spoke of long working hours. Mr. Chen shared stories about his teaching days and showed her family photos, including pictures of his late wife and their life together. Mrs. Zhang saw in him not just a lonely old man, but someone who genuinely missed having family around. "Amy hasn't stopped talking about your drawings," Mrs. Zhang said, smiling. "She lost her father 2 years ago, and it's been hard for her to connect with people since then." Mr. Chen nodded understanding. "Loss changes us, doesn't it? But sometimes life gives us unexpected chances to heal." They agreed on the birthday dinner, and Mr. Chen spent the next few days preparing with an excitement he hadn't felt in years. He decorated his dining room with simple streamers, dug out his wife's good tablecloth, and even bought a small cake from the local bakery. What Mr. Chen didn't know was that Amy had been busy too. She had told her art teacher about the kind old man who made her hot chocolate and invited her to his birthday dinner. The teacher, moved by the story, had shared it with other students and their parents. The simple birthday dinner was about to become something much more significant, though Mr. Chen wouldn't know until the next day. As he carefully measured ingredients for his wife's meatball recipe and set the table for 3, he felt grateful for this small blessing, the chance to share his birthday with others again. That night, Mr. Chen went to bed feeling more hopeful than he had in years. His house seemed less empty somehow, filled with the promise of tomorrow's dinner. He placed 3 plates on the dining table before heading to bed, unaware that his simple act of kindness was about to ripple through the community in ways he never could have imagined. In the quiet of his room, he looked at his wife's photo on the nightstand and whispered, "I think you would have liked Amy, dear. She has your creative spirit." For the first time in years, he fell asleep with a smile on his face, eager for the birthday celebration to come. This birthday would be different from all the lonely ones before it. But even Mr. Chen, with all his years of wisdom, couldn't have predicted just how different it would be, or how a simple invitation to a little girl would set in motion events that would change not just his life, but the lives of many others in their community. The morning of Mr. Chen's birthday arrived with a gentle snowfall. He woke up earlier than usual, his heart light with anticipation. The house was already filled with the aroma of herbs and spices as he'd prepared the meatball mixture the night before, just as his wife had always done, letting the flavors blend overnight. As he went about his morning routine, Mr. Chen noticed something different in the neighborhood. People who usually hurried past his house with barely a glance were now slowing down, looking at his home with curious smiles. He assumed it was because of the cheerful birthday streamers visible through his window, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening. Around noon, his doorbell rang. It was Amy and Mrs. Zhang, but they weren't alone. Behind them stood Amy's art teacher, Mrs. Parker, holding a large canvas covered with a cloth. "We're a bit early," Mrs. Zhang said with a mysterious smile, "because we need to help set up some things." Before Mr. Chen could ask what needed setting up, Amy bounced excitedly into the house, her arms full of rolled-up papers. "Can I decorate the walls, Mr. Chen? Please?" Her enthusiasm was contagious, and he found himself nodding, curious about what she had planned. As Amy and her mother began putting up her artwork, Mrs. Parker unveiled the canvas she'd brought. Mr. Chen's breath caught in his throat. It was a beautiful painting of his house in springtime, with all his beloved garden flowers in full bloom. But what made it special was that it had been signed by every student in Amy's art class, with small messages of birthday wishes surrounding the image. "Amy told us about you," Mrs. Parker explained, her eyes warm with understanding. "She mentioned how you appreciated her artwork and made her feel special when she was waiting alone. My students wanted to do something in return." Before Mr. Chen could fully process this touching gesture, more doorbells began to ring. First came elderly Mrs. Thompson from 2 doors down, whom he'd only ever waved to, carrying a homemade apple pie. Then arrived the Rodriguez family from across the street with their teenage sons, bringing chairs and extra plates. Mr. Chen stood in his hallway, overwhelmed by the steady stream of neighbors entering his home. Each person carried something, dishes of food, decorations, or small wrapped presents. They all had stories to share, how they'd seen him tending his garden over the years, how they'd admired his Christmas decorations, or how they'd been touched by his kindness to Amy. The little girl's mother explained how the community had come together. After hearing about Mr. Chen's birthday dinner invitation, Amy had drawn pictures of him in art class, telling everyone about the nice grandpa who made her hot chocolate. Her story had spread through the school, then through the neighborhood, touching hearts and reminding people of their own elderly relatives, some far away, others long gone. What was meant to be a quiet dinner for 3 had transformed into an impromptu community gathering. Mr. Chen's modest living room and kitchen were soon filled with the warm chatter of neighbors who had lived near each other for years but had rarely spoken. Children ran around playing games, teenagers helped arrange food on tables, and adults shared stories and laughter. In the kitchen, Mr. Chen found himself surrounded by helping hands. His carefully planned spaghetti and meatballs became the centerpiece of a vast potluck feast. Mrs. Rodriguez insisted on learning his meatball recipe, while Mr. Kim from the corner house added his own special touch to the sauce. Amy proudly showed everyone her designated waiting spot on the sidewalk, now visible through the window, where this whole story had begun. "That's where I met Mr. Chen," she announced to anyone who would listen, beaming with the importance of her role in bringing everyone together. The small birthday cake Mr. Chen had bought was set aside in favor of a much larger one that appeared mysteriously, decorated with colorful frosting and bearing the words, "Happy Birthday, Mr. Chen, from your neighborhood family." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, Mr. Chen sat in his favorite armchair, watching the scene before him with tears in his eyes. His house, which had been so quiet for so long, was now alive with the sound of children's laughter, friendly conversations, and the clink of plates and cutlery. Mrs. Zhang touched his shoulder gently. "Are you okay, Mr. Chen? I know this is probably more than you expected." He smiled, wiping his eyes. "You know, I've lived in this house for 40 years. My late wife and I always dreamed of having grandchildren fill it with noise and life. Today, it feels like that dream has come true, even if in a different way than we imagined." Amy skipped over and climbed onto the arm of his chair, something she already seemed to know he wouldn't mind. "This is only part one of your surprise, Mr. Chen," she whispered excitedly. "Wait until you see what's happening tomorrow." The old teacher's eyes widened with surprise. "Tomorrow?" he asked, looking around at his guests, who all seemed to be sharing knowing smiles. But Amy just giggled and ran off to join the other children, leaving Mr. Chen to wonder what else this remarkable community had planned for him. As the winter day began to fade into evening, Mr. Chen realized that his 79th birthday had become something far more significant than a simple dinner celebration. It had become a reminder that family isn't always about blood relations, sometimes it's about the connections we make when we open our hearts to others, even in the smallest ways. The morning after his remarkable birthday party, Mr. Chen woke up wondering if it had all been a wonderful dream. But the evidence was everywhere: birthday cards displayed on his mantle, leftover cake in the fridge, and Amy's artwork still decorating his walls. His house felt different now, filled with the lingering warmth of yesterday's celebrations. As he sipped his morning tea, the doorbell rang. There stood Amy and Mrs. Zhang, both bundled up against the winter cold. "Good morning, Mr. Chen." Amy chirped. "Are you ready for your surprise?" "Another surprise?" he asked, amused by the child's enthusiasm. "I thought yesterday was more than enough of a surprise for an old man like me." Mrs. Zhang smiled mysteriously. "Yesterday was just the beginning. Would you mind coming with us? There's something we'd like to show you." Curious, Mr. Chen put on his coat and followed them outside. As they walked down the street, he noticed unusual activity in the neighborhood. People were gathered in small groups, carrying tools and supplies. Some waved cheerfully when they saw him, while others quickly ducked out of sight. They led him to the community center, a building he hadn't visited in years. It was a modest place that had seen better days, with faded paint and a slightly neglected garden. But today, something was different. The parking lot was full of cars, and he could hear the buzz of activity inside. "Close your eyes," Amy instructed, taking his hand. Mr. Chen complied, allowing the little girl to guide him carefully up the steps and through the doors. The sounds of shuffling feet and whispered voices surrounded him. "Okay, open them," Amy announced proudly. Mr. Chen opened his eyes and gasped. The community center's main hall had been transformed. Where there had once been empty walls, there was now a gallery of artwork, dozens of pieces created by local children and adults alike. Each piece depicted scenes of community life, and many featured a familiar figure, himself, tending his garden, teaching in his old classroom, or sharing hot chocolate with a little girl. But that wasn't all. Tables had been set up around the room, each dedicated to a different aspect of community engagement. One station showed plans for a neighborhood mentoring program, inspired by Mr. Chen's teaching background. Another displayed designs for a community garden, with his own well-tended garden as the model. Mrs. Parker, the art teacher, approached with a folder in her hands. "After yesterday's party, we realized something important," she explained. "For years, we've had this wonderful resource, your experience, your wisdom, your kindness, right here in our neighborhood. But we never took the time to connect. Amy helped us see what we were missing." She opened the folder to reveal a proposal. The community center, which had been struggling to find its purpose, would be renovated to include a learning space where retired professionals like Mr. Chen could share their knowledge with younger generations. They would call it the Bridge Builders Program. "We'd be honored if you'd help us launch this program," Mrs. Parker continued. "Your years of teaching experience would be invaluable, and there are already several children interested in learning from you." Mr. Chen's hands trembled as he read through the proposal. "But I'm just one person," he protested softly. "Surely there are others more qualified." "You're not just one person," interrupted Mrs. Rodriguez, who had joined them. "You're the spark that helped us realize what our community could be. Yesterday, when you opened your home to us, you opened our eyes too." Amy tugged at his sleeve. "And look, Mr. Chen. I made this for the garden." She led him to a corner where a miniature model of a garden sat on a table. It featured tiny benches arranged in a circle, with a plaque that read, "Story Corner." "I thought maybe you could tell us stories about when you were a teacher," she explained. "And maybe other people could share their stories too. Mom says everyone has a story worth telling." The elderly man's eyes filled with tears as he looked around the room. Every person there represented a connection he'd never thought possible at his age. Each smile held the promise of new friendships, each project the potential for lasting change. Mr. Kim, who had helped with the sauce yesterday, stepped forward. "We've already started collecting supplies for the renovation. The hardware store has offered materials at cost, and many of us have volunteered our time and skills." "And that's not all," added Mrs. Thompson, the neighbor with the apple pie. "Remember all those photos you showed me yesterday? Of your teaching days? We'd love to create a memory wall here, showing how education and community have always been connected in our neighborhood." As Mr. Chen walked through the room, taking in all the plans and proposals, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his teaching days, a sense of purpose. Each station he visited showed him how his simple act of kindness toward Amy had created a ripple effect, awakening a dormant sense of community in their neighborhood. The children present were particularly excited, gathering around him to share their ideas. One boy wanted to learn chess, another hoped Mr. Chen could help with math homework. A shy girl clutching a notebook asked if he would read her stories, just as he had looked at Amy's drawings. Mrs. Zhang touched his arm gently. "You see, Mr. Chen, yesterday wasn't just a birthday party. It was a reminder that age is not a barrier to making a difference. Sometimes the smallest gestures, like offering hot chocolate to a waiting child, can lead to the biggest changes." Looking at the hopeful faces around him, Mr. Chen thought of his wife. She had always told him that retirement shouldn't mean retiring from life. Now, standing in this room full of possibilities, he understood what she meant. His 79th year wasn't going to be another quiet chapter in his life, it was going to be the beginning of a whole new story. "Well," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "I suppose I better start planning my lessons. But first, I believe Amy promised to teach me how to draw flowers as beautifully as she does." The room erupted in laughter and applause, but Mr. Chen hardly noticed. He was already imagining the future, the gardens that would bloom, the stories that would be shared, and the bridges that would be built, all because he had dared to reach out to a little girl on a cold winter afternoon. The weeks following Mr. Chen's birthday brought a flurry of activity to the once quiet neighborhood. The community center, which had stood half-forgotten for so long, now buzzed with energy every day. People of all ages came together, painting walls, fixing furniture, and transforming the space into something extraordinary. Mr. Chen found himself at the heart of it all, though he still couldn't quite believe how much had changed. Every morning, he would arrive to find someone new waiting to help or learn. The retired accountant from Oak Street offered to teach basic financial literacy. The grandmother who had been a nurse for 40 years volunteered to give first aid classes. What had started as one connection between an old man and a little girl was growing into a web of community support. One particularly memorable morning, Mr. Chen arrived to find Amy sitting on the community center steps, drawing in her sketchbook as usual. But today, she wasn't alone. 5 other children sat around her, their own sketchbooks open, watching intently as she demonstrated how to draw clouds the right way. "Look, Mr. Chen," she called out excitedly. "I'm teaching too, just like you." He watched as she patiently showed a younger boy how to hold his pencil more comfortably, just as he had once shown countless students how to hold their pens during his teaching days. The sight brought tears to his eyes, not of sadness this time, but of joy at seeing how naturally kindness could pass from one person to another. Inside the community center, the transformation was remarkable. The once bare walls now featured a timeline of the neighborhood's history, including photographs from Mr. Chen's teaching days alongside newer images of the community coming together. The story corner that Amy had designed in her model was becoming reality, with comfortable chairs arranged in a semicircle and colorful cushions scattered about. Mrs. Zhang had taken charge of organizing the daily schedule, balancing different activities and making sure everyone who wanted to contribute had a chance. "It's like conducting an orchestra," she explained to Mr. Chen one day. "Everyone has their own special talent to share." The Bridge Builders program was flourishing in ways no one had expected. What started as a simple idea for sharing knowledge between generations had evolved into something much more organic and beautiful. Teenagers who came for homework help stayed to teach elderly neighbors how to use smartphones. Retired craftspeople found eager apprentices among the younger residents. Every day brought new connections, new learning, and new stories. Mr. Chen's garden expertise had sparked particular interest. The neglected space behind the community center was being transformed into a teaching garden, with different sections for vegetables, flowers, and herbs. Children who had never grown anything before watched in amazement as their first seed sprouted under his guidance. "It's like magic," exclaimed a wide-eyed 6-year-old, seeing his radish seedling peek through the soil. "Not magic," Mr. Chen replied with a smile, "just patience and care. Rather like growing a community." The local grocery store where Mrs. Zhang worked had noticed the change in the neighborhood too. They began donating supplies for cooking classes and offering their parking lot for weekend farmers markets where people could sell produce from their new gardens. The owner, Mr. Patel, admitted he'd watched Mr. Chen buy his single-person groceries for years, never realizing the wealth of experience and knowledge that lay behind those quiet shopping trips. One afternoon, as Mr. Chen was helping a group of children plant sunflower seeds, he overheard 2 mothers talking nearby. "It's amazing how different everything feels now," one said. "Remember how we used to just hurry past each other on the street?" "I know," replied the other. "My kids used to spend all their time on their phones. Now they can't wait to come here after school. Yesterday, my son actually asked me if we could plant a vegetable garden in our backyard." The Bridge Builders program had also attracted attention from neighboring communities. Visitors would come to observe and learn, hoping to replicate the success in their own neighborhoods. Mr. Chen found himself sharing not just his knowledge of teaching and gardening, but also the simple truth he had learned, that community grows best when cultivated with patience, nurturing, and open hearts. Amy had become something of a local celebrity. Her initial artwork displaying Mr. Chen's house had inspired a weekly art club where children and adults came together to draw and paint. She took her role as assistant art teacher very seriously, wearing a small apron with pockets full of pencils and erasers. "You know what's funny, Mr. Chen," she said one day as they sat together during a break. "I used to hate waiting for Mom after school. Now I can't wait to come here." The community center kitchen, once dusty and unused, now filled with delicious aromas as cooking classes and community meals became regular events. Mr. Chen's famous meatball recipe had been joined by dishes from around the world as neighbors shared their family traditions and cultural heritage through food. Mrs. Rodriguez's tamales, Mr. Kim's kimchi, and Mrs. Thompson's apple pies became legendary at these gatherings. More importantly, the kitchen became a place where stories were shared, friendships were formed, and cultural barriers dissolved over shared meals and laughter. One evening, as Mr. Chen prepared to head home after a full day of activities, he found a small package on his desk. Inside was a hand-drawn card from Amy, showing a picture of the community center surrounded by people of all ages. At the bottom, in careful handwriting, she had written, "Thank you for making hot chocolate that day. You made our whole neighborhood warmer." Walking home in the gentle evening light, Mr. Chen reflected on how much had changed since that cold afternoon when he first noticed a lonely little girl sitting on the sidewalk. His house no longer felt empty when he returned to it each night, because his heart was full of the day's events, the shared stories, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to make a difference. As he passed his front porch, where it had all begun, he smiled at the small table where he had served hot chocolate that fateful day. Sometimes the smallest gestures could lead to the biggest changes. His wife had always told him that, and now he understood it in a way he never had before. As spring arrived, bringing new life to Mr. Chen's garden, something extraordinary was happening in the community. The local newspaper had gotten wind of their story, and a young reporter arrived one morning to interview Mr. Chen. She found him in the community center's garden, teaching a group of children how to transplant tomato seedlings they had started from seed. "I don't understand why you want to write about me," Mr. Chen said modestly as he helped a small boy pat soil around a delicate plant. "I'm just an old teacher who was lucky enough to meet a kind little girl." The reporter, watching him interact with the children, smiled and took notes. She observed how naturally the elderly man switched between explaining the importance of root systems to the older kids and making up stories about plant families moving to their new homes for the younger ones. That afternoon, Amy burst into the community center waving a copy of the newspaper. "Mr. Chen, Mr. Chen. We're famous." The article, titled, "How One Birthday Dinner Rebuilt a Community," spread across 2 pages, complete with photographs of their flourishing programs. But what happened next surprised everyone. Phone calls started coming in from other cities. Community leaders wanted to know how they could start similar programs. Senior centers asked about implementing their own versions of the Bridge Builders program. The simple story of an old man and a little girl had struck a chord with people far beyond their neighborhood. Mrs. Zhang found herself creating an impromptu visitor schedule as people from neighboring towns came to observe their success. "It's like we've created a blueprint for something everyone was hungry for but didn't know how to begin," she explained to Mr. Chen. "People see what we've built here and realize it's possible in their communities too." The garden became a symbol of their growing impact. What had started as a few raised beds now included a butterfly garden designed by the children, a meditation corner suggested by Mrs. Thompson, and even a small pond built by Mr. Rodriguez and his teenage sons. Each new addition reflected the personality of the community member who had contributed it. One day, while Mr. Chen was teaching a group about butterfly-friendly plants, he noticed Amy sitting alone on a bench, looking thoughtful. "Is everything all right?" he asked, sitting beside her. "I was just thinking," she replied, playing with the corners of her sketchbook. "Remember when you were lonely, and I was lonely too? Now look at us, we have so many friends we can't count them all." Her observation touched him deeply. It was true, loneliness, which had once seemed like a permanent condition of his life, now felt like a distant memory. Every day brought new connections, new stories, and new reasons to smile. The community meals had evolved into weekly cultural celebration dinners, where families shared not just their traditional dishes but also their stories. Mr. Patel, the grocery store owner, had begun hosting cooking demonstrations, teaching others how to make his mother's secret curry recipe. Mrs. Rodriguez's tamale-making classes always had a waiting list. The impact on the younger generation was particularly noticeable. Teachers from the local school reported that students who participated in the Bridge Builders program showed improved confidence and social skills. The teenagers who had once been glued to their phones now eagerly volunteered to help with various projects. One remarkable project emerged when a group of high school students, inspired by Mr. Chen's teaching stories, created a digital archive of community members' memories. They recorded interviews with elderly residents, photographed old pictures, and built a website to preserve these precious stories for future generations. "You've started something beautiful here," Mrs. Parker told Mr. Chen one evening as they watched a group of children and seniors working together on an art project. "These children will grow up knowing the value of community and connection. That's a gift that will last generations." The success of their initiative caught the attention of the city council. They proposed using their model to revitalize other community centers across the city. Mr. Chen found himself invited to speak at council meetings, sharing his experience and the lessons they'd learned along the way. The secret, he would tell them, is not in the programs or the planning. It's in remembering that every person has something valuable to contribute, and every connection, no matter how small it seems, has the potential to grow into something extraordinary. During one such meeting, a council member asked about the cost of implementing such programs. Before Mr. Chen could respond, Mrs. Zhang stood up. "The only real cost," she said, "is the cost of not doing it. We've seen children find mentors, elderly people find purpose, and strangers become family. How do you put a price on that?" Back at the community center, the daily rhythm of activities continued. Mr. Chen's morning gardening classes were now accompanied by Mrs. Thompson's storytelling sessions, Mr. Kim's Tai Chi in the garden, and dozens of other activities that brought people together. Amy had started a welcome committee with several other children. Whenever new families moved into the neighborhood, they would greet them with hand-drawn maps showing all the community center activities and, of course, an invitation to join their next meal together. One afternoon, as Mr. Chen sat in his now favorite spot in the community garden, he overheard two elderly gentlemen who had recently joined their programs. "I used to think getting old meant becoming invisible," one said. "But look at this place, here, everyone has value, everyone has something to teach and something to learn." "I know what you mean," replied the other. "My daughter wanted me to move into a retirement community, but after seeing what's happening here, she's actually considering moving to this neighborhood instead." These conversations reminded Mr. Chen of something his wife used to say: "Life is like a garden, it's not about how much space you have, but how well you tend to what's growing there." Their community had become a garden of relationships, carefully tended and flourishing beyond anyone's expectations. As spring bloomed into early summer, Mr. Chen received an unexpected letter. It was from a community foundation in the state capital, inviting him to receive an award for innovative community building. But what touched him most wasn't the recognition, it was the letter's last paragraph, which mentioned that several other cities had already begun implementing similar programs, creating their own versions of the Bridge Builders program. "Your story," the letter read, "reminds us that it's never too late to create meaningful change, and that the simplest acts of kindness can transform entire communities." The autumn air was crisp and cool as Mr. Chen stood on the stage of the City Hall auditorium, looking out at hundreds of faces. 6 months had passed since his birthday dinner, and he could hardly believe where that simple evening had led them. Today was the first regional community building conference, and their neighborhood had inspired it all. As he adjusted the microphone, his eyes found Amy in the front row, sitting between her mother and Mrs. Parker. She gave him 2 thumbs up, wearing the special t-shirt she had designed for their community center volunteers. The shirt featured a simple drawing of a house with an open door and the words, "Everyone belongs here," written in cheerful colors. "When I invited a little girl to my birthday dinner," Mr. Chen began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I was just a lonely old man hoping to share a meal. I never imagined that simple invitation would lead to all of this." The audience listened intently as he shared their story. Representatives from 30 different cities had come to learn how they could rebuild their own communities. But Mr. Chen wasn't just telling them about programs and schedules, he was sharing the heart of what they'd created. He told them about Mrs. Thompson, who had been considering moving to a retirement home but now ran 3 weekly reading circles for children. He spoke about Mr. Rodriguez's teenage sons, who had started a weekend sports program that brought together young and old for gentle exercise and lots of laughter. The true magic, he explained, happens in the small moments. It's in the way a child's face lights up when their first seed sprouts, or how an elderly person stands a little taller when sharing their life experiences. It's about creating spaces where everyone feels they matter. After the presentation, people crowded around their information booth, where Amy and her young friends were proudly showing off their community center scrapbook. The children had documented everything, from the first garden plantings to their most recent harvest festival. "See this page?" Amy explained to an interested visitor, pointing to a photograph. "This is where Mr. Chen taught us about butterflies. And look, this is our friendship bread. Everyone gets a piece of starter dough to take home and make their own bread, then they share it with someone new." The success of their program had brought unexpected changes to the neighborhood. Property values had risen as more families moved in, attracted by the strong sense of community. But they had been careful to ensure that long-time residents weren't pushed out. Mr. Patel, along with other local business owners, had created a neighborhood trust to help elderly residents maintain their homes and stay in the community they had helped build. One of the most remarkable developments had been the time bank system they created. People could earn time credits by sharing their skills or helping others, then use those credits to receive help when they needed it. Mr. Chen had earned countless hours teaching gardening and mentoring children, which he often donated to neighbors who needed extra support. Back at the community center, new programs were constantly evolving. A group of retired teachers had started an after-school homework club, which had grown to include college application guidance and career mentoring. The teenagers who received help often returned to tutor younger children, creating a continuous cycle of learning and giving. The garden had expanded beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a few raised beds now included a small orchard, a community herb garden, and even a greenhouse built from recycled materials. Local restaurants had begun featuring produce from the garden, creating a small source of income that funded new community programs. One particularly touching initiative had emerged from an unexpected source. A group of children, inspired by Mr. Chen's story, had started the "Nobody Eats Alone" program. They organized regular dinners where anyone who usually ate alone could come share a meal with others. The program had become so popular that they now needed 3 different dining rooms to accommodate everyone. Mrs. Zhang had recently reduced her hours at the grocery store to become the community center's first paid coordinator. "It's amazing," she told Mr. Chen one day. "A year ago, I was worried about making ends meet as a single mother. Now, Amy has dozens of surrogate grandparents, and I'm doing work that really matters to people." The impact on the children was perhaps the most profound. Teachers reported that students who participated in the community programs showed improved emotional intelligence, better academic performance, and stronger social skills. The intergenerational friendships they formed gave them a deeper understanding of life and a greater sense of empathy. One day, as Mr. Chen was teaching a group of children about preparing the garden for winter, a small boy asked him a question that made him pause. "Mr. Chen, were you always happy?" He sat down on a garden bench, inviting the children to gather around. "No," he answered honestly. "After my wife passed away, I was very lonely. I thought that part of my life, the part where I could make a difference, was over. But then I met Amy, and she helped me remember something important: it's never too late to open your heart to others." The children nodded solemnly, and one little girl spontaneously gave him a hug. These moments of genuine connection had become common in their community, replacing the polite distance that had once been the norm. As the days grew shorter and the holidays approached, the community center buzzed with activity. They were preparing for their first Festival of Traditions, where families would share their holiday customs and celebrations. The art room was filled with children making decorations, while the kitchen wafted with the scents of holiday dishes from around the world. One evening, after a particularly busy day, Mr. Chen found Amy sitting in their now famous story corner, drawing in her sketchbook. "What are you creating?" he asked, sitting beside her. She showed him the drawing. It was a picture of their community center, but she had drawn it as a tree, with branches reaching out in all directions and different activities happening in each branch. At the roots, she had drawn two figures, a little girl and an old man sharing hot chocolate. "See," she explained, "everything grew from here. Like you always say about the garden, from small seeds grow big things." Mr. Chen felt tears well up in his eyes as he looked at the drawing. In just 1 year, they had transformed not just their neighborhood, but themselves. The lonely old man and the waiting little girl had planted a seed of kindness that had grown into something more beautiful than either could have imagined. As they sat together in the quiet corner, the sounds of community life echoed around them, children laughing in the art room, the clatter of cooking classes in the kitchen, the gentle murmur of the senior book club meeting. Each sound represented a connection made, a life touched, a story shared. 1 year had passed since that fateful birthday dinner. Mr. Chen stood in his garden on a warm spring morning, tending to the roses his wife had planted years ago. As he carefully pruned the branches, he reflected on how much had changed in just 12 months. His house, once a quiet sanctuary of memories, had become a bustling hub of activity and joy. Today was special. It was his 80th birthday, and unlike the solitary celebration he had planned last year, this one promised to be very different. Amy had been mysteriously busy for weeks, whispering with others and quickly hiding papers whenever he came near. Her excitement was contagious, though she refused to reveal any details about what was being planned. As he finished his gardening, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Chen. Are you ready?" Amy stood at his garden gate, practically bouncing with anticipation. She wore a new dress and carried her ever-present sketchbook. "Ready for what?" he asked, playing along with the secrecy that had surrounded this day. "You'll see." She took his hand, the same way she had done countless times over the past year, leading him toward the community center. But today, they took a different route, walking through the neighborhood streets where their story had begun. As they walked, Amy pointed out different houses and locations, each now holding a special memory. "Remember when Mrs. Thompson taught us all how to make bread there? And that's where Mr. Rodriguez's sons built the first little free library. Oh, and look, that's where we had our first outdoor movie night." Each spot they passed had been transformed from anonymous space into a place of connection and community. The sidewalk where Amy had once waited alone was now adorned with hopscotch patterns and chalk art. Front yards that had once been simply decorative now featured vegetable gardens and sharing boxes. When they finally arrived at the community center, Mr. Chen gasped. The entire building and surrounding gardens had been transformed into a beautiful celebration space. Paper lanterns hung from trees, and tables dotted the lawn, each one decorated with centerpieces made by the Children's Art Club. "Surprise!" called out hundreds of voices as people emerged from behind trees, buildings, and garden structures. Not just their immediate neighbors, but people from all over the city and beyond, representatives from every community that had been touched by their story over the past year. Mrs. Zhang stepped forward, holding what looked like a large book. "Mr. Chen, when you invited Amy to your birthday dinner last year, you started something remarkable. We wanted to show you exactly what that simple act of kindness grew into." The book was a beautifully bound collection of stories, photographs, and letters from people whose lives had been changed by the Bridge Builders program. There were notes from elderly people who had found new purpose, letters from children who had discovered mentors, and messages from communities across the country who had started their own programs. "But that's not all," Amy announced proudly. "Show him, Mom." Mrs. Zhang unveiled a sign that had been covered with a cloth. It read, "Chen Community Garden, where kindness grows." Below it was a beautiful bronze plaque that told their story, beginning with a lonely birthday dinner invitation and expanding into the movement it had become. "We wanted everyone to remember how this all started," Amy explained, "so they'll know that big changes can start with small kindnesses." The celebration that followed was everything Mr. Chen's previous birthday had been and more. Children ran through the gardens, playing games they had invented together. Teenagers taught elderly residents new dances while seniors shared stories of their own youth. The community kitchen produced an endless stream of dishes that represented every culture in their neighborhood. As evening approached, everyone gathered in the garden for a special presentation. The children's choir, which had formed during one of their cultural exchange programs, sang a song they had written especially for Mr. Chen. The lyrics spoke of growing gardens, building bridges, and making room for everyone at the table. After the song, Amy stood up to make a speech. Her voice, once shy and uncertain, now rang out clear and confident. "Last year, I was just a little girl waiting on a sidewalk. Mr. Chen could have just walked past me, like everyone else did. But he didn't. He showed me that when you open your heart to one person, you open the door for many more." She unveiled her latest artwork, a large canvas that showed their community as it was now, full of life and color, with small vignettes of all the connections that had been made. In the center was a simple scene of an old man and a little girl sharing hot chocolate on a porch. Mr. Chen was called to the podium to speak. Looking out at the gathered faces, familiar and new, young and old, representing so many different backgrounds and stories, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Someone asked me recently what the secret was to building such a strong community," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The truth is, there is no secret. It's about seeing each person as someone worthy of your time and attention. It's about understanding that everyone has something to teach and something to learn. Most importantly, it's about remembering that it's never too late to make a difference in someone's life." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the celebration, Chinese lanterns were lit and released into the evening sky. Each one carried a wish for the future, written by members of the community. Mr. Chen watched them rise, thinking about how different this birthday was from his last. Amy tugged at his sleeve. "Make a wish, Mr. Chen." He smiled, looking at the wonderful scene around him. "My wish already came true, dear. Last year, I wished not to be alone anymore, and look what happened, I gained an entire community of friends." The little girl hugged him tightly. "And next year will be even better." As the celebration continued into the evening, with music and laughter filling the air, Mr. Chen sat in his favorite garden spot. He thought about his wife and how proud she would be of what their home had become. The roses she had planted now bloomed alongside new gardens, just as the love she had taught him to share had grown into something bigger than he could have imagined. The story of the lonely old man and the little girl had become legend in their community, shared with each new person who joined their growing family. But more importantly, it had become a reminder that the smallest act of kindness could spark the biggest changes, that it was never too late to start something new, and that true community could grow anywhere people were willing to open their hearts to each other. As Mr. Chen looked up at the lanterns floating in the darkening sky, he smiled, knowing that this was not the end of their story, but rather a new beginning. The seeds of kindness they had planted would continue to grow, spreading from one heart to another, from one community to the next, creating connections that would last for generations to come.